Not too long ago, I published a short 60-second video that's been kicking up quite a bit of dust. The video is called The End of Hebrew Roots, and in it, I ask a single yes or no question that puts Torah-observant theology on the horns of a dilemma. This short, which I'm going to show you in a minute, has already generated hundreds of heated comments from all sides, and even some response videos from a few people. And there are some interesting rebuttals and counter arguments that have come up too. I'll link to the video below in case you want to read through the comments. Now, of course, the nature of a 60-second video, especially one on theology, is that it's always going to raise more questions than it can answer. There's just no way to make a comprehensive, sweeping theological statement in 1 minute. So today, I want to unpack the core claim that I made in this short video. And I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain and show you why I worded the question the way I did, and the logic behind asking that question, and the presuppositions that it challenges. But first, I need to clean up the clutter and address a couple common misconceptions about the question I asked, because some viewers just took the discussion off the deep end. To make sure we're all on the same page, here is the original video that sparked all the discussion. Here is a single yes or no question that topples the theology of Hebrew roots, or Torahism. Does God still require animal sacrifices to atone for sin? If your answer is no, that's no longer how we atone for sin, which, by the way, is the correct biblical answer, guess what? You're acknowledging that the Old Covenant law is no longer in effect, because the Torah explicitly requires animal sacrifices to atone for sin. And if your answer is yes, they are still required, well, then you've put yourself in quite a pickle. Because first of all, if that's the case, why did Jesus die on the cross? Was his sacrifice not enough to atone for all sin? And secondly, that answer directly contradicts the New Testament, which teaches that Jesus was our ultimate sacrifice of atonement, who appeared once for all at the culmination of the ages to do away with sin by the sacrifice of himself, and therefore, sacrifice for sin is no longer necessary. So I made a very specific point, and there's a method to the logic behind it. Many folks who have commented on this video across all our socials have read more into my claim than I actually said, or even intended to say. Instead of taking it at face value, they've read additional layers of meaning into it. So let me clear up a couple misconceptions. First of all, many commenters immediately went down the path of discussing what those Leviticus 16 sacrifices actually did. What was their purpose or function? These comments came from viewers who were clearly thinking of Hebrews 10, which says that the sacrifice of bulls and goats could never truly take away sin. So we got a lot of comments like these. Mr. Muid and Caroline P9F and Matt Clevinger all responded by pointing out that those animal sacrifices never atoned for sin. And NSL said something very similar. The 5 sacrifices weren't to atone for sin, but were tribute. JF5177 got even more detailed. He said, the Tanakh says in Hosea 14:2, forgive and accept what is good. Instead of bulls, we will offer our lips. So you're wrong. 1 Samuel 15:22, listening is better than sacrifice. Compliance is better than fat of rams. Rion Mouton said, there's a difference between atonement for sin and removal of sin. And Mr. H4 said, where did God say sins were removed by animal sacrifice? Did God change? And DanMan6 said, Leviticus 16 was never given as a way for redemption. So you get the idea. And I agree with most of these comments. I believe the Mosaic sin sacrifices were required for exactly the reason Hebrews 10 says. They were a bloody and continual reminder of sin, ultimately intended to point us to Christ. They were a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. The Leviticus 16 sacrifices temporarily covered the sin of the Israelites, but they were never intended to bring ultimate atonement or forgiveness. They prefigured the sacrifice of Jesus. Now, that said, this entire topic has nothing to do with my original question. I didn't ask about the purpose or the scope of the Torah's sin sacrifices, right? I simply asked this carefully worded question. Does God still require animal sacrifices to atone for sin? That's it. It's not why were they required? It's not what did they accomplish, but rather, are they required? Probably the second most common line of argument that we saw in the comments was the claim that the reason we don't make animal sacrifices right now is because there's no temple. Viewers said things like, last I checked, the temple in Jerusalem is still destroyed, and there is no temple, and we just can't make sacrifices now because there's no temple. And Israel couldn't make sacrifices between the first and second temples, but that didn't mean the Torah ended. And here again, these responses are completely missing the point. I'm not asking if we can make animal sacrifices to atone for sin today. I'm asking if we should. It's not whether we're physically capable of carrying them out. It's whether that is still how God requires us to atone for sin. Because there is no denying that the Torah required animal sacrifices to atone for sin. Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of the creature is in the blood, and I have given it to you." Why? To make atonement for yourselves on the altar. It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life. And look at the actual commands in Leviticus 16 for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Verse 11, Aaron, the high priest, shall bring the bull for his own sin offering to make atonement for himself and his household. Verse 15, he shall then slaughter the goat for the sin offering for the people. Verse 18, then he shall come out to the altar that is before the Lord and make atonement for it. He shall take some of the bull's blood and some of the goat's blood and put it on all the horns of the altar. Verse 24, then he shall come out and sacrifice the burnt offering for himself and the burnt offering for the people to make atonement for himself and for the people. Verse 30, on this day atonement will be made for you to cleanse you. Verse 34, this is to be a lasting ordinance for you. Atonement is to be made once a year for all the sins of the Israelites. So, we can have a discussion about what those atonement sacrifices actually accomplished in the grand scheme of things. And that's a fascinating conversation which takes us directly to the cross. We looked at this very thing in our video on Hebrews 7, which I'll link to below. But there is no denying that under the Old Covenant, A, animal sacrifices were required, and B, they were required for sin atonement. The biblical evidence for that fact is overwhelming. These were commandments given by God himself, and they were holy and righteous and just. And the question is this: does God still require animal sacrifices to atone for sin? Is that still the case today, even after the death and resurrection of Jesus? Let me give you a little peek behind the curtain here. First, here's how I specifically worded this question. It starts, does God still require? And this is based on the clear fact we just established, which is that under the Old Covenant, God did require these things, right? So the fundamental question I'm asking is this: did something change, right? God once required these things. Does he still require them? That's the question. And then I indicated the scope of the question. First, this is specifically about animal sacrifices. The question isn't about other types of offerings like grain or food or drink. It's just about animal sacrifices. And then the last phrase tightens the scope even further: to atone for sin. The question isn't about all sacrifices. It's not about sacrifices for thanksgiving or peace offerings or any of the other types of sacrifices commanded in the Torah. We're talking specifically about the animal sacrifices that atoned for sin as commanded in Leviticus 16. So the scope of the question is very targeted. This is why all those comments about needing a temple or what the sacrifices actually accomplished are missing the point. And the logic behind this question is very targeted as well. In my short video, you saw that I said my question topples the theology of Torahism, right? I might have used a little hyperbole there, but I stand by that statement. It doesn't topple that theology immediately like a bulldozer knocking over a building. It's more like, it's like dropping a hand grenade in a heating duct which later explodes and puts a crack in the foundation of the building, which throws the building off balance and eventually causes it to fall. Here's what I mean. The theology of Torahism, and I'm using broad brushstrokes here because there's not one monolithic movement where everyone subscribes to the exact same doctrines. But this theology in general teaches that Christians are under the Old Covenant law and that not keeping all of the Mosaic commandments is disobedient and sinful. That's the general theological thread that connects a wide variety of groups and movements that all fall under the umbrella of Torahism. So what does that mean exactly? Well, most of the time, this theology manifests itself in just three areas: observing the seventh-day Sabbath, keeping a kosher diet, and observing the Torah feasts. Now, depending on who you talk to, there may be other commandments that are practically observed as well, such as ritual circumcision or wearing tassels and so on. And many in this movement also like to condemn Christmas and Easter. And one of the proof texts used by many Torah-keeping Christians is Matthew 5:18, where Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." Now, I take this passage to mean that heaven and earth would sooner disappear than Jesus fail to accomplish his mission. In other words, I believe Jesus is saying that not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished, right? And the phrase, all is accomplished, doesn't refer to every last thing that God will ever do. Jesus is specifically speaking of his work on the cross and his resurrection, which would inaugurate the new covenant. And then I believe that is the mission he has in mind here. And in Luke 24, the resurrected Jesus tells his disciples, "Hey, remember when I told you that everything written about me must be fulfilled? Well, guess what? You were witnesses of these things. You saw it happen before your very eyes." Now, most Torah keepers, on the other hand, will look at Matthew 5:18 and interpret it to be saying, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until heaven and earth pass away. In other words, not a jot or a tittle has yet passed from the law because heaven and earth are still here. And they build their entire theology on that interpretation. Again, I'm making a generalization here, but I know many of them do. 119 Ministries is one example of a group that does their theology this way. And so if this is your interpretation, that as of today, not an iota or a dot of the law has yet passed, then you have to affirm that everything required in the Torah is still required today. And that brings us to the question. The logical premise of this question is this: God required X under the Old Covenant. Is X still required today? The question is that simple. It's essentially a binary question. There are really only two basic answers: either yes or no. Of course, that doesn't mean there aren't all kinds of layers and nuance that can be applied to either of those two answers. But at the end of the day, God either still requires animal sacrifices to atone for sin, or he doesn't. Again, this question has nothing to do with what those sacrifices accomplished or whether we can physically carry them out today. The fundamental question is simply this: has something changed? And this question, when it's rightly understood and honestly answered, puts the theology of Torahism on the horns of a dilemma. And it's a dilemma that, if a Torah-keeping Christian is genuinely seeking the truth and willing to be honest, this question will either end up requiring them to reject or at least make major updates to their Torah-keeping theology, or it will require them to reject or at least radically reinterpret the Bible. Let's follow the logic. If your answer to this question is no, that's not how we atone for sin anymore, that's great. I agree with you. And I'm convinced this is the correct biblical answer. We no longer atone for sin through the sacrifice of animals. The book of Hebrews couldn't make this any clearer. It says that Jesus has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself, and that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And therefore, there is no longer any offering for sin. Now, the problem for Torah keepers is that answering no to our question requires them to make a couple of uncomfortable acknowledgments. First, they have to admit that at least some of the Old Covenant laws are no longer in effect. At a bare minimum, they're admitting that the commandments in Leviticus 16 for sin atonement have come to an end. There's no longer any offering for sin. This means that our Hebrew roots friends can no longer hold the position that the entire Old Covenant law is in effect today. In fact, it means that much more than a jot or a tittle of the law has passed away. And so they may need to reassess their interpretation of Matthew 5:18. And second, answering no to this question opens up a can of theological worms for them. Because if they admit that these particular Leviticus 16 laws are no longer in effect, well, then it means that other Old Covenant laws may have ended as well. The door has been opened. And here's the thing. Sin sacrifices and atonement are a major theological theme in the Bible that ultimately leads us, again, directly to the cross and the sacrifice of Jesus. So this is not a secondary matter. It's a gospel issue. And now, on the other hand, if your answer is yes, animal sacrifices are still required to atone for sin, well, then you've put yourself in an even bigger pickle. Because the first thing you're going to need to explain, and it's a doozy, is this. Why did Jesus die on the cross? We just read Hebrews 9:26, which says that Jesus has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And the phrase, once for all, is a single word in Greek, unpacks, which means taking place once and to the exclusion of any further occurrence. It's the idea of once and never again. In fact, this larger passage in Hebrews 9 talks about how under the Old Covenant, the Levitical high priests not only had to offer animal sacrifices for their own sins, they had to do so repeatedly. By contrast, it says that Jesus is a high priest who is, as Hebrews 7:26 describes him, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. And Jesus offered his own blood, not the blood of bulls and goats, as the final sacrifice for all sin for all time. Which is why, as we saw, the author of Hebrews declares, there is no longer any offering for sin. So, if your answer is that, yes, animal sacrifices are still required to atone for sin, well, what did the death of Jesus on the cross accomplish? And believe it or not, I'm not making this up. There are some who actually hold that position. Adam Playfarm said, I think you know the sacrifices will be restarted. Henry Hodgins said, the commandments of animal sacrifices for sin covering were never rescinded. They are still in effect. User CG said, yes, of course there will be sin sacrifices again in the millennium. Does God lie? And if this is your position too, then I'm genuinely curious how you work it out. How do you read the passages we just looked at, which say that Jesus was our once and for all sin sacrifice, and there is no longer any offering for sin, and at the same time, you believe the sin sacrifices will be restarted at some point in the future? How does that work? Did the sacrifice of Jesus only atone for some sins, but not all of it? And so Christians will need to begin sacrificing animals again at some point to what? Atone for the rest of the sin that Jesus couldn't cover? This is the kind of uncomfortable position that has caused many of our Torah-keeping friends to sort of scramble for their footing. Because another important part of their theology, and again, I'm speaking in general terms here, but many Torah keepers are firmly convinced that a third temple will eventually be rebuilt, and the Levitical priesthood will be reinstituted, and sacrifices will resume in the millennial age. And I'm certainly open to the possibility that there might be some sort of offering or sacrifice offered in that era. Will it be animal sacrifices? I'm honestly not sure. But I don't believe that in the very end, there will be animal sacrifices in the new heaven and the new earth, because Revelation 2:4 says there'll be no more pain and no more death at that time. But the question is this: in the millennial age or in some future era, will sacrifices be reinstituted for the purpose of atoning for sin? Well, based on what we just read about how there's no longer any offering for sin, I would have to say no. And here's where an interesting theory comes up. Many people have suggested some version of the idea that the animal sacrifices will be restored in the millennial age, but as memorial offerings, as a remembrance of the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And depending on how that idea is approached, I can see why it's compelling. A viewer named Jared shared this. I had just cracked open this huge book I bought 5 years ago called Israelology by Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He lays out the view on pages 774 through 77 that it's supposed to be like a Jewish Eucharist in a literal millennium. So not a reinstitution of the law of Moses, but something to help them remember, although it's not only a memorial. And I have to admit, the idea of a Jewish Eucharist is really interesting in how it's linked to the way that Jesus commanded us to remember his sacrifice. Although his commandment is that we eat bread and drink wine, not the actual flesh and blood of animals. And that's the thing that gives me pause when it comes to this idea. Is it possible that we'll have some kind of memorial animal sacrifices in the millennium? Maybe. But when it comes to today, the here and now of living out our faith, Jesus has already given us a commandment for how to remember his sacrifice. It's called the Lord's Supper, communion. So whatever may or may not happen in the last days, we know what Jesus commanded for us today. We are to eat the bread and drink the wine in remembrance of his sacrifice. And there's one last thing to be said about this memorial sacrifice idea. If that's the case, it still amounts to a change in the Old Covenant law, because the Torah explicitly required those animal sacrifices for what? To atone for sin. We saw that in black and white in Leviticus 16 and 17. And if, in the millennium, the purpose for those animal sacrifices were to shift from sin atonement to a remembrance, well, then the Torah commands have still changed, because the Torah required them for atonement. And on top of that, if there's some sort of Jewish Eucharist in which animal sacrifices commemorate the death of Christ, that would be more evidence that the Old Covenant law has ended, because that law expressly prohibited the drinking of actual blood. All right, that's all I got. Let me know what you think. Thanks for tuning in. Shalom.